Funding for the production of this program was provided in part by Brigham Young University Religious Education. The Sidney B. Sperry Symposium is an annual academic conference held at Brigham Young University. The symposium honors the memory of former religious education instructor Sidney B. Sperry. The theme for the 2004 symposium is Prelude to the Restoration, From Apostasy to the Restored Church. This address by Matthew Richardson was given on October 30th, 2004. Dr. Richardson is the Associate Dean of Religious Education at BYU.
Some time ago, our family was driving through Provo Canyon when one of our daughters proudly proclaimed, "Hands over your hearts." Dutifully, we all placed our hands over our hearts as Megan provided the color commentary for the event. "This is where it all began," she said proudly, "where Mom and Dad first held hands." It was true. In fact, in my mind's eye, I could see a younger me driving down the canyon with a beautiful co-ed. Somehow our hands became intertwined and I had no desire to sort the mess of fingers out, even though I needed to shift gears as my car picked up speed going down the canyon. I quickly surveyed the situation and realized that if I let go of Lisa's hand, there was a good chance that I may never get to hold it again. So I concluded that trading a transmission for a moment of heavenly hand-holding was, to borrow a phrase from my children, a no-brainer. To this day, the transmission still does not get a second thought when it comes to holding my wife's hand. But I do wonder whether or not I should hold my wife's hand and place my other hand over my heart while driving. I am confident that even after all these years, it is more than likely that my wife's hand and covering my heart will most likely prevail again. Thus, for those of you who drive in Provo Canyon, consider this your warning. Beware of sentimentals driving in the general vicinity of Bridalveil Falls. Whenever I am reminded of this or similar events, I like to say, usually in an ethereal tone, destiny. While my children look at this event as the beginning, it really wasn't the beginning at all. There is no doubt that this event marked the starting of our relationship and could easily be considered an identifiable event that made us an official item. But in a way, this beginning was also an ending. It was a culmination of many events, both small and large, that led up to the beginning. These events were prelude to the Canyon event, necessary events that made the Canyon bliss possible. Prelude events could have included my feeble introduction that I made at Lisa's apartment 2 weeks earlier. A simple smile, "Hi, my name is Matthew Richardson," and the firm missionary handshake. It could have included the not so obvious to me, but very obvious to every other person with a brain, strategy that I used of borrowing things from Lisa's apartment in hopes of meeting her. I didn't mention the times that I accidentally bumped into her on campus, which really weren't very accidental at all, but it was strategy. And when I'm in my destiny mood, I like to cite the time when Lisa happened to notice a childhood photograph of me in a family album when we were visiting my home. She later produced a photograph of her with uncanny similarities. Little wonder that at our wedding reception, my mother-in-law enlarged the pictures to poster size and included a caption, "Will you hold the line for 15 years?" For 2 decades that have followed, both my wife and I have often commented that it was a miracle that we found each other. And I do believe it is true. The word miracle is actually derived from the Latin, meaning to marvel at and or wonderful. In this sense, it was marvelous and wonderful that it has all worked out for us so far. As for destiny, destiny. I can't say whether or not it was, but with hindsight, these events seem to be more than mere coincidence. Consider, for example, Thomas S. Monson's feeling that, quote, "there is a guiding hand above all things. Often when things happen, it is not by accident. One day, when we look back at the seeming coincidences of our lives, we will realize that perhaps they weren't so coincidental after all, close quote. Using this as a backdrop, consider another miraculous event. With enthusiastic anticipation, Isaiah prophesied of a marvelous work and a wonder that would come forth following certain apostasy. This work not only included the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, but also involved the restoration of the fullness of the gospel of Jesus Christ. We typically begin the story of the restoration in a grove of trees in 1820. But remember that other factors, even those in prelude to the beginning, should be considered if one truly desires to understand the miracle. Such considerations could include the implications of the prophesied apostasy, the gathering, production, and restoration of sacred texts, as well as the contributions of scientists, philosophers, theologians, and clergy who made honest efforts to find and understand divine truth. It may be well to consider the political and even the social changes that were needed so that a restoration could be accommodated. Some may even ponder why the marvelous work and wonder began in New York, and why, of all places, Palmyra. Some may wonder why Joseph Smith was to be the restorer rather than perhaps a more notable character of the time. Others try to understand how those who contributed so much to the restoration even became acquainted or associated. Was it all by chance? Was it coincidence? Was it destiny? I prefer miraculous. This restorative work, marvelous in scope and significance, was not conceived in notable circles of theologians, scholars, or philosophers. It would have been utterly impossible for this movement to take place at any recognizable location, as did other events in human history. In fact, this prophesied restorative work could only begin at one place in the world, a region that relatively few knew, Palmyra, New York. This alone may cause one to wonder. The restoration is inseparably linked to Palmyra because within a relatively unobtrusive and common-looking hill nearby, a sacred record was buried. This record, written and deposited in the hill by ancient prophets, would become known as the keystone to the doctrine of the church and was directly associated with the miraculous restorative events during 1820 to 1830, and still has great profound implications today. Thus, burying the record would, in what would later be known as New York, determined the geographical beginning of the restoration. Another fixed facet of the restoration to consider was the foretold participation of a seer who would be raised up with the power to bring forth the word of God. Joseph of Egypt prophesied that this seer would be a deliverer like unto Moses, and that, quote, his name shall be called after me, and it shall be after the name of his father, close quote. President Brigham Young later clarified that it was Joseph Smith who would be the seer, for, quote, it was decreed in the councils of eternity, long before the foundations of the earth were laid, that he should be the man in the last dispensation of this world to bring forth the word of God and to the people, and receive the fullness of the keys of the power of the priesthood of the Son of God, close quote. Thus, a specific man and a specific hill had to meet. The logistics of this alone would cause most to wonder. It was marvelous. As incredible as these foretold events were, there is still more to consider. There were those who would provide invaluable assistance in bringing forth the restoration. They were the means to further the work, those whom Nephi described as 3 witnesses who would see Cumorah's record and testify to the truth of the book and the things therein. Thus, Martin Harris, Oliver Cowdery, and David Whitmer also had to converge within reasonable proximity to the fixed geographical region of Palmyra and somehow be connected to the foretold seer. Their connection was necessary for the restoration to be set in motion. The story of how the record, the seer, and the witnesses of the restoration converged just at the right time is miraculous, for it incites wonder and it moves us all to marvel. Now, the prophet Joseph Smith's road to Palmyra was a lengthy journey of delays, detours, disappointments, and at times, heart-wrenching trials. It was a journey that began long before his birth. While some may consider the Smiths' eventual move to Palmyra as coincidence or fate, it is wise to once again consider President Monson's feeling that, quote, there is a guiding hand above all things, close quote, and that often, when things happen, it is not by accident. In this light, the hardships, trials, and mishaps experienced by the Smith family not only molded their characters, but served to move them in certain directions. Perhaps even the Smiths were surprised to find themselves in Palmyra, for there is no record of divine manifestation directing them. Unlike Moses or Lehi, who were foretold of a promised destination, it seems the Smiths were unable to make sense of the journey, that long journey to Palmyra, only after they have arrived. And then it was difficult to ignore the guiding hand above all things. The Smiths' road to Palmyra was a generational journey. Perhaps a good starting point would be to consider Ebenezer Mack, who was Joseph Smith Jr.'s maternal great-grandfather. He was described as a man of considerable property and lived in good style. He was in a good position to leave his family in security with both property and a comfortable living. Yet through a series of misfortunes, he was reduced to poverty, and his son Solomon was bound out, which means apprenticed, as a youth. Apparently, this condition influenced Solomon to spend his entire lifetime consumed in obtaining riches. His quest to find comfort and prosperity was never realized, and Solomon finally concluded that, quote, the Lord would not suffer me to prosper, close quote. Rather than sinking deep roots on a spacious family farm, Solomon's attempt to secure reasonable means to make a living eventually led him and his family to Gilsum, New Hampshire. It was while Solomon was living in Gilsum that his son, Stephen, a successful businessman, sought to have his sister, Lucy, live with him and help care for his growing family. Lucy Mack returned with her brother, Stephen, to Tunbridge, Vermont in 1795, while her parents, Solomon and Lydia Gates Mack, remained in Gilsum. Joseph Smith's father's family was of Puritan stock, with deep generational roots in Topsfield, Massachusetts. Samuel Smith, who was Joseph Smith Jr.'s paternal great-grandfather, was well respected and even served in community positions. Samuel's second son, Asel, Joseph Smith's grandfather, that's Joseph Smith Jr.'s grandfather, left the family farm, only returned to Topsfield, Massachusetts, in hopes of saving the family farm from the burden of debt. Asel's attempt to save the farm were in vain, and after spending time in Ipswich, Massachusetts, Asel sought inexpensive land in Vermont. He took his sons, Jesse and Joseph Sr., with him to clear land in 1791, and the Smith family moved to Tunbridge, Vermont. It was in Tunbridge that Joseph Smith and Lucy Mack met and eventually married in 1796. Now, Joseph Smith Sr. and Lucy Mack Smith began their married life under reasonably favorable circumstances. With modest business success, Joseph Sr. became interested in investing in ginseng, a root thought to prolong life and restore virility. It grew wild in Vermont and was of great value in China. Unfortunately, he was cheated in the venture and was left financially ruined. And for the next 14 years, the Smiths worked day labor and resorted to tenancy rather than land ownership. It was under such conditions that Joseph Smith Jr. was born on December 23, 1805 in Sharon, Vermont. After enduring the typhoid outbreak in 1812, the Smiths began farming in Norwich, Vermont, on Esquire Murdoch's property. Lucy Mack Smith wrote, quote, "The first year our crops failed, yet by selling fruit which grew on the place, we succeeded in obtaining bread for the family," close quote. Unfortunately, the second year of crops also failed, and the last straw came in 1816. Often called the year without a summer, 1816 saw unusually wintry conditions throughout the spring and summer, making it impossible to raise crops. When the crops failed for a third time, Joseph Smith Sr., discouraged and broken, determined to leave Vermont. His brothers had already moved to New York by 1815, and Joseph thought it might be well to follow in their footsteps. Joseph Sr.'s desire to leave Vermont was not singular. In fact, Vermont experienced a mass exodus of those who left in hopes of finding more favorable conditions elsewhere. The Smiths found their way to the village of Palmyra, New York in 1816. Through sheer determination and a united effort by parents and children, the Smiths worked to secure a tract of land in Manchester, which was on the borders of the township of Palmyra. This happened sometime in 1818. After building a snug cabin, the Smiths continued to work the land and secure odd jobs to make ends meet. At this point, they were located less than 3 miles from a drumlin that would later be called the Hill Cumorah. Now, the Smiths were living just off Stafford Road, bordering Palmyra and Manchester. Conditions were set for the unfolding of the marvelous restoration. Granted, the road to Palmyra had been arduous and had been long, but now the chosen seer was present. In 1820, Joseph would enter a grove of trees that surrounded the Smith log home, and this experience would set in motion a series of marvelous, yes, even miraculous events. In 1827, after yearly visits to the Hill Cumorah, Joseph would obtain the sacred record and begin translating its contents. 3 years later, the Church of Jesus Christ would be restored again in Fayette, New York, which is less than 30 miles from Cumorah. It is interesting that the Lord's hand in moving Joseph Smith into the position to receive the place was wrought not only upon him, but upon previous generations of his family as well. While circumstances of the moment, poor personal decisions, natural disaster, and even decisions made by others seemed unfortunate and surely unbearable at the time, the Smiths and the Macks were influenced by such experiences that comfort might have otherwise eclipsed. Likewise, some may conclude that the desperate ice summer of 1816 was bereft of any godliness, and they may be surprised to find, after careful inspection, to find God in the event. This was the culminating event, after all, that persuaded the Smiths to leave Vermont and seemed to direct them further along the road to the area of Palmyra. Upon later reflection, Brigham Young said, quote, "The Lord had his eye upon him," referring to Joseph Smith, "and upon his father, and upon his father's father, and upon their progenitors. He has watched that family and that blood as it has circulated from its fountain to the birth of that man." Close quote. Truly miraculous. The road to Palmyra for Martin Harris was much shorter than for the Smiths. Now, this does not discount the influences on or the reasons for earlier members of the Harris family to immigrate to new country and to settle in Palmyra, New York. But much of Martin Harris's pre-Palmyra history is only slightly known. We do know that Martin Harris was born on May 18th, 1783 in Easttown, New York. He was described by one of his early contemporaries as, quote, an industrious, hard-working farmer, shrewd in his business calculations, frugal in his habits, and what was termed to be a prosperous man in the world, close quote. He married his cousin Lucy Harris in 1808 and over the next several decades managed over 240 areas of productive land. In addition to his farming skills, Martin Harris was a man of varied talent. He won prizes in local fairs, produced textiles, and raised animals. He was also active in civic affairs, participating in local defensive campaigns during the War of 1812, and serving as a town manager and overseer of the highways in Palmyra. It is clear by almost every account that Martin Harris maintained a respectable reputation. Now, with Harris already established in Palmyra, it is how his path intersected that path of Joseph Smith that is of particular interest and of importance. Harris became acquainted with the Smith family sometime after their arrival in Palmyra. It seems that he first became associated with the Smiths when he employed some of the members of their family. Now, this makes sense since the Smiths were eager to find means to support themselves and better their circumstances. Beyond this scope, the depth and the frequency of their association is uncertain. According to Harris, it was well after Joseph Smith's first vision in 1820 that he began to personally investigate the religious claims of the young prophet. Although it is certain that Harris knew the Smiths by this time, at least through their business association, he was cautious in his involvement with the Restoration. In fact, he first waited for his wife and his daughter to make inquiries about Joseph's experiences before he began his own personal investigation. But by 1828, Martin was confident enough in his opinion of the Restoration that he found himself helping Joseph by acting as his scribe in the translation. The path to the Restoration for Martin Harris was not predictable, nor was it easy. For by 1829, it was well known in Palmyra that Martin Harris was directly connected with the Restoration, and even though he was a Palmyra local with an essentially impeccable character, he was publicly criticized and scorned for this connection. In spite of the scorn, Martin Harris was unafraid to show public support of Joseph and the Restoration. In addition to giving personal assistance, Harris was also the financier of both the prophet and the work of the Restoration. Now, little did he realize that the very land that he successfully cultivated would one day become the ransom for publishing Cumorah's record. Now, like Joseph Smith's path, Oliver Cowdery's road to Palmyra can be traced to the generations before his birth. Unlike the Smith family, where financial ruin, unfortunate mishap, and even natural disaster uprooted and moved the family, Oliver's heritage was moved by different means. Oliver Cowdery's fourth great-grandfather, William Cowdery, was staunch in his belief of personal religious freedom and the right of free worship. Inspired by personal beliefs, William pursued a quest of religious worship by coming to America with the Pilgrim movement in 1630. For several generations, the Cowderys made their home in Massachusetts, and then Nathaniel Cowdery moved to Reading, Vermont to settle in 1786. Nathaniel's grandson, William Cowdery Jr., married Rebecca Fuller and became the father of Oliver Cowdery on October 3rd, 1806. It is interesting to note that Oliver's mother, Rebecca Fuller, was the great-granddaughter of John Fuller and M. Rowley, who were the second great-grandparents of Lucy Mack Smith, the mother of Joseph Smith, Jr. So this made Oliver Cowdery and Lucy Mack Smith third cousins. There's no evidence, however, that Oliver knew of his family relationship with the Smiths. Oliver Cowdery was raised in Vermont, and although some of his brothers left the family home in search of better situations in New York, Oliver stayed in Vermont until 1825. In 1828, Oliver's brother, Lyman, was hired to teach at a rural school in Manchester, New York. Unfortunately, Lyman could not fulfill the assignment and suggested to the trustees of the school that his younger brother, Oliver, might be given the post in his stead. The trustees of the school, which, by the way, included Hiram Smith, approved Oliver as the replacement, and he began his employ in 1828. At this point, Oliver had not only found the road to Palmyra, but he now found himself as the master of a schoolhouse located on Stafford Road, only a mile east of the Smith home. With such close proximity, it was really only a matter of time before his path would intersect the prophet Joseph Smith's. It was the general custom of the day that the master of the rural school would board with families of his students in lieu of charging tuition. Thus, Oliver met the Smiths under this circumstance. Now, remember that Joseph was in Harmony, Pennsylvania at this time and was not at the Smith homestead. And according to Lucy Mack Smith, Joseph's mother, it was while Oliver was staying with them that he, quote, began to hear from all quarters concerning the plates, close quote. Rumors of the miraculous events had been circulating in Palmyra since the first vision in 1820. To think that Oliver would not hear of the rumors, especially when he was boarding with the Smith family, would be odd indeed. With piqued curiosity, Oliver began to petition Father Smith for more information about the incredible experiences. Naturally, the Smiths were cautious in sharing tales of visions, angels, and golden plates, especially with strangers. Lucy Mack Smith admits that after, quote, considerable length of time, close quote, Oliver gained the confidence of Joseph Smith Sr. and was given a sketch of the facts relative to the plates. The accounts of the restoration that Father Smith shared with Oliver made a deep impression on him. He couldn't seem to escape thinking about the events and finally determined that he must meet Joseph Smith Jr. After making it a subject of prayer, Oliver firmly believed that it was the will of the Lord that he should go to Harmony, Pennsylvania. With a sense of guiding hand above all things, as Oliver put it, Cowdery was resolute in his desire to leave for Harmony and related to Lucy Mack Smith, quote, "If there is a work for me to do in this thing, I am determined to do it," close quote. Thus, in late March 1829, Oliver Cowdery and Samuel Smith left Manchester to meet the prophet Joseph Smith Jr. in Harmony, Pennsylvania. Granted, to some, Oliver's generational journey to Palmyra may have been surprising, but in truth, his arrival and intersection with the promised seer were already foreseen. For Joseph, Oliver's arrival was none too soon. In March of 1829, the Lord assured Joseph Smith, quote, "I will provide means whereby thou mayest accomplish the thing which I have commanded thee." Only weeks later, Joseph met Oliver, the promised means to the restorative end. Almost immediately after his arrival, Oliver Cowdery began working as Joseph's scribe in the translation of the Book of Mormon and was also witness to the marvelous work of the restoration. With Oliver at Joseph's side, the restorative events began to unfold at a wondrous pace. We have now considered Joseph Smith, Martin Harris, the Hill Cumorah, and Oliver Cowdery. We cannot forget David Whitmer. David Whitmer was born January 7th, 1805, near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. His journey to Palmyra began when his parents, Peter and Mary Musselman Whitmer, left Pennsylvania for New York in 1809. The Whitmers settled with other Pennsylvanian Germans in Fayette, New York, which happened to be only 30 miles from Palmyra. The eventual parents of 8 children, the Whitmers were respected citizens in the area. According to David Whitmer, he arrived in Palmyra because of business dealings. His initial connection to the Restoration, however, was through Oliver Cowdery. For in 1828, David Whitmer was on business in Palmyra when he heard townsfolk discussing golden plates that were found by a local resident named Joseph Smith. Initially, Whitmer dismissed the claims as gossip, but when he talked further with a man by the name of Oliver Cowdery, who just happened to be living in Palmyra at the time, his disposition changed. Oliver Cowdery said that he knew the Smith family and believed that there was some truth to the story, and that he planned personally to investigate the story further. David, who was 23 years old at the time, returned to Fayette, New York, with a promise that Oliver Cowdery would advise him of his personal investigation. Well, David was informed months later that Oliver Cowdery intended to actually visit Joseph Smith in Harmony, Pennsylvania, where the prophet was living near his in-laws. In the spring of 1829, Oliver Cowdery and Samuel Smith made their way to Harmony, Pennsylvania. Both Oliver and Samuel visited the Whitmers in Fayette on their way to visit Joseph Smith in Pennsylvania. Little did anyone realize at this point that within a year's time, the Church of Jesus Christ would be organized at that very spot in Fayette. Oliver and Samuel departed to visit Joseph, and shortly afterward, David received another letter from Oliver giving a positive testimony to his inquiries regarding Joseph and the plates. In a later communication, Oliver told David that he was acting as scribe for Joseph as they translated the plates found in Palmyra. Oliver even included several lines from the translated work, which David shared with his family in Fayette. A later communication from Oliver requested David to come to Harmony and bring Oliver and Joseph back to Fayette to board with the Whitmers while they finished the translation of the prophetic record. After consulting with Father Whitmer, David was set to bring both Oliver and Joseph to Fayette pending completion of the spring planting. The request for David to leave Fayette for Harmony could not have come at a more inconvenient time. Fall harvest was dependent on a successful spring planting, and the Whitmers were depending on a successful fall harvest. With David's responsibility to prepare the soil for the spring planting, it would appear that his road to meet the prophet Joseph Smith, Jr. would be delayed or at least or even possibly canceled. But when David returned to his fields to resume plowing, he found that 5 to 7 acres had been plowed during the night. He was therefore able to complete the plowing in short order. What might have appeared as coincidence to some bore the mark of guiding hand above all things the next day. For when David went to spread the plaster of Paris, a common soil preparation of the day, he found that the work was already done. His sister said that her children had called her the day before to watch 3 strangers spreading the plaster with remarkable skill. She assumed that they had been hired by David or by Father Whitmer. It seemed clear that the guiding hand of divine intervention would clear necessary roadblocks that would have impeded David Whitmer from completing his journey and connecting with the prophet Joseph Smith, Jr. David drove the 3-day journey of about 100 miles to Harmony to bring Oliver and Joseph back to the Whitmer farm. They returned to Fayette around the 1st of June in 1829. The Whitmers received their new guests warmly. According to Joseph, Father Whitmer extended an invitation to stay with them free of expense for as long as was needed to complete the work. In addition to the temporal support provided by the Whitmers, David, John, and Peter Whitmer Jr. became the prophet's zealous friends and assistants in the work. With David's road to Palmyra region and his connection with the prophet Joseph Smith complete, he assisted in the restorative works that included his name on the charter of a newly established church, which was organized in his home, Peter Whitmer's home, in 1830. When President Howard W. Hunter recalled the restorative events, he reminded the Smiths that this marvelous work was the fruit of the most humble beginnings. Such beginnings began to take shape long before the first vision in 1820. The fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy of a marvelous work and wonder to come forth may have seemed implausible when he spoke it. Aligning the factors necessary for a restorative effort is nearly incomprehensible to the logistical mind. The prelude to such restorative events required individuals to be uprooted, endure follies of their peers, be moved upon in unseen ways, and make connections with others that would yield a harvest beyond their mortal understanding and beyond their grasp. This prelude was not coincidence, nor was it mere fate. The divine arranging to bring the restorative work to pass was a wondrous work indeed. Elder Neil A. Maxwell reminds us that, quote, his, meaning God's, overseeing precision pertains not only to astrophysical orbits, but to human orbits as well, close quote. In such manner were the human orbits of Joseph Smith, Martin Harris, Oliver Cowdery, and David Whitmer aligned. Such alignment was a wondrous prelude to June of 1829, when, at the Whitmer home, those individuals, after a family devotional, retired together to the woods. With a marvelous experience, they became forever known as the witnesses of the foretold restoration. In their testimony to the work, to all nations, kindreds, tongues, and people, Martin Harris, Oliver Cowdery, and David Whitmer testified that they, quote, beheld and bear record that these things are true, close quote. And then they stated, in perhaps which is one of my most favorite lines in the testimony inscribed in the foreword of the Book of Mormon, and concluding their testifying remarks, they said, quote, and it is marvelous in our eyes, close quote. But there were to be other witnesses of the restoration. Joseph was told that in addition to his testimony and the testimony of the three witnesses, that others would testify unto condemnation of this generation. Who were these witnesses? In the Doctrine and Covenants we read, quote, and behold, whosoever believeth on my words, them will I visit with the manifestation of my Spirit, and they shall be born of me, and their testimony shall also go forth, close quote. Thus all those who fit this description join as witnesses of the marvelous restoration. I suspect that just as the early witnesses of the restoration were moved upon by events that put them in the right place at the right time, that we too, those who have been moved upon by the Spirit of the restoration and testify therewith, have had similar experiences. For example, consider my personal membership in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. When did it all begin? When I was baptized? Now, when I was baptized, I was numbered in the statistical category of increase in children of record. In other words, my parents were members, and I had just turned 8 years old. I was already on the records of the church, having received a name and a blessing as a child. But there was more of a prelude to my beginning than merely as an 8-year-old. There were events that converged, making my baptism possible, even though it was a mere commonplace statistical event. For example, my father was baptized only 6 years before baptizing me. He investigated the church for years. prelude to his baptism were the prayers and the fasting of ward members, ecclesiastical leaders, 26 sets of missionaries and their endless discussions, and the earnest prayers of a faithful wife, my mother, who was desperately hoping for a miracle. Well, what about my mother's ancestry, who were converted in Denmark, crossed the plains, and became part of the early quest of Zion? Aren't they part of my beginning as well? And I haven't even mentioned the events of my own personal experiences, even prior to that event as an 8-year-old, of answered prayers and the many mentors who helped me along the way to that point and since then. You see, I am confident that as we look back on the seeming coincidences of our lives, they are in reality prelude to our testimony, to your testimony, whatever events those may have been, as small or as large as they were in our lives. I suspect that we too will recognize that those events were a guiding hand above all things. And we too may conclude that when things happen, it is not merely by accident. We may not realize, at least at this present time, that our inconveniences, our detours, our trials, our follies, and the follies of others, as well as perhaps our successes, the ponderings which we undertake, and those answers, whether large and small, to our heartfelt prayers, and those promptings and movings within our lives were not so coincidental after all, and may be prelude to new beginnings, or perhaps even our new beginnings. I testify to you that the restoration was directed by a loving and knowing Father in heaven. It was a miracle, for it was both marvelous and wondrous. Although different in scope, I add my testimony to those witnesses of the restoration. I testify that the gospel of Jesus Christ and his church has been restored. I testify that Joseph Smith was a prophet and did translate the golden plates to the Book of Mormon, which is indeed the keystone to our religion. I testify that those individuals, which unbeknownst to them, seemingly gathered at that place to join with the seer, that they too were witnesses of the divine restoration, and the testimony penned at the beginning of every copy of the Book of Mormon is indeed a testimony of heart and true. Brothers and sisters, I know there is a God in heaven and that Jesus Christ does live, that his church has been restored. I know personally that it was a miracle, and therefore it is marvelous in my eyes. And this I say in his name, Jesus Christ. Amen.
For more information on this Sperry Symposium address, visit our website at byubroadcasting.org. This address by Matthew Richardson was given on October 30th, 2004. Dr. Richardson is the Associate Dean of Religious Education at BYU. Funding for the production of this program was provided in part by Brigham Young University Religious Education.